My work in climate change communication has mostly to date looked at the role of terminology in public discourse on climate change. So for example, the terms global warming and climate change. Now of course these terms mean technically different things, which of course climate scientists know well, but nevertheless from a communication standpoint, these terms are often used interchangeably and sometimes even treated as synonyms in public discourse, in particular in the United States, where the climate debate has become so politically polarized. And so what we've done in this work is we tried to tease apart, using survey experiments, the different ways that the public thinks about these different but related terms. And we found some interesting effects. So for example, when we randomly assign members of the United States public to complete a survey that's worded in terms of global warming as opposed to climate change, what we find is that the public is much more accepting of climate change as a real and serious problem that should be addressed when the survey itself is worded in terms of climate change. When it's worded in terms of global warming, what we see is a bigger partisan divide between Democrats and liberals on the one hand, and Republicans and conservatives on the other hand, who tend to be more skeptical of the issue. And I think that this difference is actually pretty important because, for example, what we see is that when surveys are worded in terms of global warming, we actually have only a minority of Republicans saying that the phenomenon is really happening. But when we just switch the term to climate change, all of a sudden we see a majority flip. Now, the majority of Republicans are expressing a high level of belief that the phenomenon is really happening. Now, I think there's a number of possibilities for why we're seeing these different reactions to the terms climate change and global warming. I mean, on the one hand, of course, they are different terms, right? Climate change refers to the broader suite of changes, multiple effects occurring because of human actions. Global warming obviously is just one small part of that, and that refers, of course, specifically to the unidirectional increase in global average surface temperatures. But I think because these terms mean different things, they prime people in the moment to think about different concepts and to recall different experiences that they've had. And so when we talk about global warming, it's so easy to have your attention directed towards temperature concepts. And for example, say you've been experiencing unseasonably cold weather recently. Well, now all of a sudden people might draw on that salient temperature experience and use that to question whether or not global warming is actually occurring. And climate change, because it's a larger, more abstract concept, might be more robust to those kinds of effects. So, in addition to the different cognitive concepts, that is, the content that these different labels bring to people's minds, climate change versus global warming, it's also possible that people have very different emotional or affective reactions to the two terms. People have pointed out in the literature that global warming seems to have more of a dire, catastrophic ring to it than climate change. So it's definitely possible that just simply the term global warming invites more negative reactions that people might resist, especially people like Republicans and perhaps conservatives in the United States who have historically shown or expressed greater levels of skepticism that climate issues are real and pressing matters for the public. Yeah, in terms of the broader literature in climate change communication, I think, and there's a number of really interesting things that we're seeing come out of that literature that sort of challenge how we think about how the public perceives important scientific issues. So I'll share one, which is the relationship that scholars have found between self-reported knowledge about climate issues, or perhaps even education on the one hand, and on the other hand, concern about climate change. And what we see in the literature across a number of studies now is that even though we normally expect a sort of one-to-one relationship between education and concern, we're not seeing that. The story is a little bit more complex than that. So we do see that for certain subgroups groups in the United States, again, where the issue is highly politicized. So we see that relationship for Democrats and for liberals. However, when you look at people on the more conservative side of the political spectrum, sometimes that relationship between education and concern is relatively flat, and some studies even find a negative association between those two variables. And I think this is an important reminder that when we're thinking about public concern about scientific issues, it really does seem to be about more than simple information acquisition. That is to say that people's pre-existing values and their pre-existing beliefs and their group affinities and affiliations matter for how they perceive the same piece of scientific information. I think one of the practical takeaways from our work on global warming versus climate change terminology is that we should be really careful when we are interpreting polls of the US public. So for example, a lot of polls on climate change, they come out with headlines saying that the public is really divided on the issue of climate change. But what we see is that when we actually look at how the survey questions were worded, they are often worded in terms of global warming. And so I think that really a takeaway is that the US public, partisans on the left and the right, are actually closer on the issue than it may appear from surveys that are worded in terms of global warming. I don't think climate change communication scholars, unfortunately, have discovered a magic bullet messaging strategy yet. Instead, what the literature shows is that there are a number of different message factors that seem to promote more pro-environmental attitudes and beliefs on climate change, depending on context, depending on who the audience is and the sources and the like. But I'll highlight a couple of message features that I think would be part of a sort of comprehensive strategy, like that educators should have in their toolkit, and try to infuse these into messages whenever possible. The first is that recent research is suggesting that by highlighting the strong scientific consensus that climate change is really happening and that it poses some dire consequences for human societies and the planet, that seems to invite less skepticism among traditionally skeptical audiences and to increase their willingness to support pro-environmental policy. So highlighting scientific consensus is one promising avenue. I would say the second comes from other research recently suggesting that by reframing climate-related issues in terms of its consequences for people, for societies, and for public health, in addition to its more traditional framing as an environmental issue, that can also help invite people who are traditionally more skeptical to the table and hopefully increase their motivation to do something about the problem.